The dust of Redemption Creek settled on shame. It coated the back of Alara's throat, a gritty film of humiliation that tasted of metal and mockery. The church bell, which had promised a beginning, now tolled a funeral dirge for her dignity. He wasn't coming. The words had not been spoken, but they hung in the suffocating heat of the clapboard church, heavier than the unsaid prayers. The pews, filled with faces that had known her since birth, were a gallery of pity and morbid curiosity. She saw Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, whisper behind her fan to the seamstress, her eyes like polished stones. She saw the children, usually, her students, fidgeting in their Sunday best, their innocent confusion a sharper sting than any adult scorn. They were watching their teacher, Miss Alara, the woman who taught them letters and sums, dissolve into a town spectacle. Her father, a man whose spine had been bent by drought and disappointment, stood beside her, his hand hovering near her elbow, a useless, trembling gesture of comfort. The wedding dress, stitched from her mother's own, felt like a shroud of lies, its lace trim scratching at her neck, a cruel reminder of a future that had just been stolen from her in the most public way imaginable. The preacher, a man whose sermons on forgiveness now seemed a cosmic joke, finally cleared his throat. "It appears Mr. Sterling has been detained." The word was a flimsy veil over the raw, naked truth. Abandoned. Jedediah Sterling, with his silver-buttoned waistcoat and promises as smooth as river stones, had not been detained. He had fled. He had chosen his father's fortune, the sprawling ranch on the far side of the valley, over her. The whispers had been there for weeks, faint as a moth's wing against a window pane. Sterling's father had disapproved. A schoolteacher with no dowry, no land, was not a suitable match for their burgeoning empire. Alara had ignored them, clinging to Jedediah's heated glances and whispered vows in the moonlight. She had believed in the goodness she saw in his eyes, a goodness she now understood was just a reflection of her own foolish, hopeful heart. A boy at the back, one of the younger Miller's sons, snickered. The sound was a crack in the dam of her composure. The heat rushed to her face, a furious, burning tide. She could feel the collective gaze of the townspeople pinning her to the altar like a butterfly to a corkboard. She was no longer Alara, the quiet, respected teacher. She was a cautionary tale, a ghost of a bride haunting the scene of her own demise. Her father's hand finally fell on her arm, a weak, papery touch. "Come, child, there's nothing left here." But where was there to go? Her small room at the back of the schoolhouse now felt like a cage. The town itself was a prison of knowing glances and feigned sympathy. As she turned, the movement stiff and robotic, her gaze fell upon the open church doors, framing the vast and different expanse of the frontier. The sun beat down on the dusty street, bleaching the world of color, leaving only the harsh outlines of her reality, and in that frame a shadow lingered. A man on a dark horse, just at the edge of town where the wild grasses began. He was too far to see clearly, but his stillness was a rebuke to the frantic, fluttering panic in her chest. He sat there, a silent observer to her unraveling, as unchanging as the distant, jagged mountains. For a heartbeat, their gazes seemed to lock across the chasm of her disgrace. Then he turned his horse and was gone, a wisp of dust in his wake. The image stayed with her, a strange, unsettling premonition. A prayer, desperate and formless, tore from her soul. Anyone, anywhere but here. The church bell fell silent, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the rustle of 100 judgments as she walked out of the life she had known and into the merciless, open wilderness of what came next. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. The chill of the high desert night began to creep in, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the hollowness that had taken root in her bones. She had walked, she didn't know for how long. Her feet, in their delicate wedding shoes, were blistered and raw. The white dress was now trimmed with the dirt and grime of the road, a fitting adornment for her sullied reputation. She had walked away from the town, away from the whispers that followed her like stray dogs. She had ended up on the old logging trail, the one that led nowhere, or so the townspeople said. It led to the broken lands, the rocky, unforgiving territory that bordered the mountains. It led to his place. Silas Kane. The name itself was a warning. A man who had come to Redemption Creek a few years back, buying the old, dilapidated homestead that had belonged to the massacred Miller family. He was a ghost story parents told their children to make them behave. A man with a face scarred by fire or fury, no one knew for sure. He never came to town for supplies, sending a half-breed boy instead. He spoke to no one. He was a wound the town had decided to ignore, a piece of darkness they cordoned off with superstition and fear. They said he was a deserter, a murderer, a man who had lost his soul in the war. They said his land was cursed, haunted by the ghosts of the family that had died there. And it was toward this curse, this darkness, that Alara's feet had carried her. Because the only thing more terrifying than the monster in the stories was the reality of her own life. To return to town was to face a slow public death by 1,000 paper cuts of pity. To go on was to face the wilderness, a swift death by starvation or exposure. The cabin of Silas Kane was a third option. A gamble, a final desperate prayer. The cabin was barely visible in the gloaming, a dark shape hunched against the rising bulk of the mountains. It was smaller than she'd imagined, more broken. The roof sagged in the middle, and the fence was a series of splintered skeletal posts. A single weak light flickered in the window, a lone firefly in a sea of encroaching black. This was madness. She should turn back. But her feet were lidden. Things rooted to the spot. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and rain and something else, something wild and lonely. It whipped a strand of hair across her face, stinging her cheek. It was the sting that moved her. The physical sensation, a welcome distraction from the maelstrom inside. She took a step, then another, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and roots that seemed to grab at the hem of her dress, trying to pull her down. She reached the door. It was made of rough-hewn planks, scarred and weathered. There was no knocker. For a long moment, she just stood there, her breath catching in her throat. What was she doing? What would she say? I was left at the altar and have nowhere to go. Can I stay with the town monster? The absurdity of it, the sheer, insane desperation, almost made her laugh. The sound that escaped was a dry, broken sob. She raised a trembling hand, the knuckles white and bloodless. She knocked. The sound was shockingly loud in the immense silence. It echoed, a plea against the unyielding wood. She waited. The light in the window vanished. The silence that followed was different. It was a listening silence. She could feel him in there, a presence on the other side of the door, holding his breath just as she was holding hers. She was about to turn away, to give in to the fear and retreat into the night, when she heard the scrape of a bolt being drawn. The door opened a crack, a sliver of darkness, deeper than the night around them, then an eye. A single piercing blue eye that seemed to burn in the shadows. It surveyed her, from the filthy hem of her wedding dress to the tear-streaked ruin of her face. It was not a kind eye. It was an eye that had seen too much, that expected nothing. A voice, rough as granite, scraped from the darkness. "What do you want?" The words caught in her throat. She opened her mouth, but only a choked sound came out. She tried again, forcing the syllables past the lump of grief. I have nowhere to go." The eye blinked, slow and deliberate. The silence stretched, thin and taut. She could hear the wind moaning through the pines, a lonely, desolate sound. She thought he would close the door, bolt it, and leave her to the mercy of the night. She braced herself for the final rejection, the one that would surely break what little was left of her. Then, the doors swung inward. He stepped back into the shadows of the cabin, a tall, broad shape that blocked out the faint light from the hearth. He didn't invite her in. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply created a space, an opening in the darkness. "The storm's coming," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You'll die out there." It wasn't an offer of salvation. It was a statement of fact. A choice between two kinds of death. One swift and cold in the coming rain, the other slow and uncertain in the home of a broken man. Ilara took a breath, the air sharp and cold in her lungs. She looked past him into the Spartan fire-lit room. She saw a rough-hewn table, a single chair, a stone fireplace where a small fire struggled for life. It was a place of profound, aching loneliness. It was a mirror to her own soul. She took a step, crossing the threshold from the world that had cast her out into the world of the outcast. The door closed behind her, the sound of final, irrevocable severing. The bolt scraped back into place, shutting out the night, shutting out the town, shutting out everything she had ever known. She was in the monster's den, and for the first time in hours she felt the terrifying, fragile flicker of something that might, one day, be hope. The cabin was one room, a testament to survival, not comfort. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, old leather, and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like dried blood or old grief. Silas Kane moved away from the door, and, for the first time, she saw him clearly in the firelight. The stories had not been lies. A scar, puckered and white, ran from his right temple down across his cheek, pulling at the corner of his mouth in a permanent, faint sneer. It was a brutal mark, a map of some past violence that made you want to look away, yet you couldn't. His hair was dark and shaggy, his shoulders broad enough to block out the world. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, like a bear that had learned to live in a cage too small for it. He didn't look at her. He went to the fireplace and prodded the embers with a poker, coaxing the flames back to a sullen, orange glow. Ilara stood by the door, a pale specter in her ruined dress. The silence was a physical thing, a weight in the small room. It was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the rising howl of the wind outside. She should say something. Thank you. But the words felt hollow, inadequate. What did you say to a man who had just saved you from a death he seemed to be intimately familiar with? "There's a blanket on the cot," he said, his back still to her. He gestured with the poker toward a narrow, straw-stuffed mattress in the darkest corner of the room. "It's all I have." She looked at the cot, then back. At him. He was a stranger, a man the whole town feared. And she was to sleep in his home, under his roof. The fear that had been her constant companion all day coiled in her stomach, but it was a different kind of fear now. Not the hot public fear of humiliation, but a cold, private fear of the unknown. She clutched her arms around herself. The thin fabric of the dress no defense against the chill that seeped from the very walls of the cabin. He must have sensed her hesitation. He turned his head, and his one good eye, the left one, met hers. The scar twisted his face, but his eye was surprisingly clear. It held no malice, no threat, only a profound, bottomless weariness. "I won't touch you," he said, his voice flat. "I have no interest in brides." The word hung in the air, laced with a bitterness so deep it was almost a physical taste. He turned back to the fire. The conversation, if it could be called that, was over. Slowly, numbly, Ilara moved toward the cot. Each step was an effort. The wedding dress, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a costume from a play in which she had forgotten all her lines. She sat on the edge of the cot, the straw rustling beneath her. The blanket was coarse wool, smelling of dust and cold. She pulled it around her shoulders, the rough texture a strange comfort against her skin. From this corner, she watched him. He moved with a practiced economy, checking the latch on the single window, adding another log to the fire. He was a man, accustomed to solitude, his movements a silent dance with the shadows in his home. He pulled the single chair to the hearth, but he didn't sit. He stood beside it, one hand resting on its back, and stared into the flames. He was a fortress, walled off and impenetrable. The storm broke then. The first drops of rain hit the roof like scattered pebbles, quickly building to a deafening roar. The wind shrieked, rattling the window in its frame. Outside was chaos, a world being torn apart. Inside, there was only the fire, the silence, and two broken people who had nothing left to lose. Ilara lay down on the cot, pulling the blanket up to her chin. She didn't take off the dress. To do so would be to admit it was truly over, that the dream was dead. She lay there, listening to the storm rage, her body trembling with a cold that went bone deep. She watched the unmoving silhouette of Silas Kane, a sentinel guarding a fire in a world of darkness. She didn't know if she had found a savior or a captor. She only knew that for tonight, she was not alone in the storm. And as exhaustion finally dragged her under, her last conscious thought was not of Jedediah, or the town, or the shame. It was of the strange, scarred man who stared into the fire, as if searching for something he had lost in the flames long ago. The world returned to her in slivers of gray light and the smell of coffee. Ilara opened her eyes to the unfamiliar ceiling of the cabin, the rough-hewn beams dark against the morning light. The storm had passed. The silence was absolute. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the day before crashed down on her, a physical blow that left her breathless. The church, the whispers, the long walk, the door. She sat up, her heart pounding. The wedding dress was a wrinkled, mud-stained disaster. She was a disaster. Silas was not there. The fire had been banked, a bed of glowing coals radiating a gentle warmth. A tin mug of black coffee sat on the floor beside her cot. She stared at it. It was a simple gesture, an act of, what? Hospitality? It was more than she had received from anyone in her own town. Hesitantly, she reached for it. The metal was warm. She took a sip. It was strong and bitter, and it jolted her awake, chasing away the last vestiges of sleep and despair. She drank it slowly, the warmth spreading through her chest, a small anchor in the turbulent sea of her emotions. The cabin door was slightly ajar, letting in a sliver of the bright, clean-washed morning. She stood, her limbs stiff and sore, and walked to the door. She peered out. The world was reborn. The rain had washed the dust from the air, and the landscape was a vibrant tapestry of greens and browns. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue. And there, in the middle of it all, was Silas. He was at the edge of the small, cleared patch of land that served as his yard, his back to her. He was chopping wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe was the only sound. He moved with a powerful, focused intensity, each swing a release of some contained force. The muscles in his back and shoulders bunched and coiled under his worn shirt. He was a part of this wild, untamed land as much as the rocks and the pines. She watched him for a long time, the tin mug clutched in her hands. This was her new reality. A one-room cabin, a scarred stranger, and a future as blank and vast as the sky above them. The life she had planned, the neat, orderly life of a schoolteacher and a wife, was gone. In its place was this, raw, unpredictable, terrifying, and yet, as she watched him work, a strange feeling began to stir within her. It wasn't hope. It was something harder, something more resilient. It was the first faint stirring of a will to survive. She had been a victim yesterday. Today, she did not know what she was. But she knew she could not stay in this ruined dress forever. She had to do something. She had to start. She turned back into the cabin. It was a mess. Not of dirt, but of disuse. A layer of dust covered everything. The single window was grimy. The floor needed to be swept. It was a place where someone existed, but did not live. She found a broom, its bristles worn and uneven, in a corner. She found a bucket and a rag. She went to the small creek that ran behind the cabin, the water shockingly cold, and filled the bucket. And then she began to clean. She swept the floor. The rhythmic scrape of the broom, a counterpoint to the thud of the axe outside. She scrubbed the grime from the window, letting in more of the brilliant morning light. She wiped the dust from the table, from the single shelf that held a few tin plates and a worn copy of a book she couldn't read from this distance. She worked for hours, losing herself in the simple, repetitive tasks. It was a way to reclaim some small piece of control in a life that had spun so violently out of it. She was not cleaning for him. She was cleaning for herself. She was scrubbing away the shame, the pity, the memory of those staring eyes. With each stroke of the rag, she was erasing the woman who had stood at the altar and creating someone new in her place. Someone who could survive in a one-room cabin at the edge of the world. When Silas finally came back in, the sun was high in the sky. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes sweeping over the room. He took in the clean window, the swept floor, the faint smell of damp earth and soap. He looked at her, standing by the table, her hair coming loose from its pins, her face smudged with dirt, the sleeves of the wedding dress pushed up to her elbows. His expression was unreadable. The scar on his face seemed to pull his mouth into a deeper frown. He said nothing. He walked to the water bucket by the door, took the dipper, and drank deeply. Elura's heart hammered against her ribs. She had overstepped. She had invaded his space, his solitude. She had tried to impose her own sense of order on his carefully constructed world of neglect. He was going to tell her to leave. She braced herself for the words. He finished drinking and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at the table, then at the single chair. He looked at the cot in the corner. Then he looked at her. "There's another one," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Another what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Chair," he said, "in the shed. It's broken." And then he turned and walked out again. Elura stared after him, her mind reeling. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't an acceptance. It was a task, a challenge, a broken chair in a shed. It was the beginning of a conversation that had no words. It was the first fragile thread of a connection being woven in the silence. She went to the door and looked out. He was standing by the woodpile, his axe resting at his side. He was waiting. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight to find the broken chair. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. They were two planets in a tiny, shared orbit, circling each other in a universe of silence. The cabin was their world. The work was their language. Elura found the chair. One of its legs had splintered. Silas watched her as she examined it, his expression impassive. He didn't offer to help. He simply went to his small collection of tools, took out a saw and a hammer, and placed them on the ground near her. Then he walked away, back to his endless task of clearing the stubborn, rocky land. She had never mended a chair in her life. She was a teacher. She worked with books and minds, not wood and nails. But she learned. She sawed a new leg from a piece of scrap wood, her first attempts clumsy and crooked. The saw bucked and slipped, biting into her skin. She cursed under her breath, the unladylike word a small, satisfying rebellion. She hammered the nails, bending. The first two, her thumb throbbed where she had struck it. But she kept at it, her frustration hardening into a fierce, stubborn resolve. By dusk, the chair stood on four legs. It was wobbly. It was ugly, but it was hers. She had made it. She carried it into the cabin and set it by the table, opposite his. When Silas came in that night, He glanced at the chair. He walked over to it, pressed down on the seat, testing its strength. It wobbled, but it held. He said nothing. But that night, for the first time, he sat in his own chair at the table to eat his meager meal of dried meat and hardtack. And Alara sat in hers. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of their knives against the tin plates and the ever-present crackle of the fire. The silence was still there, a vast empty space between them, but now it was a shared silence. They were two people. At a table, not just two strangers in a room. The work was relentless. The land was a harsh master. Silas was trying to clear a new field for planting, a back-breaking battle against a lifetime of rocks and roots. Alara, seeing his struggle, picked up a bucket and began to carry the smaller rocks to the edge of the clearing, building a low wall. He never asked her to. He never acknowledged her help. But one morning, she found a pair of thick leather gloves on the wobbly chair. They were too big for her, but they saved her hands from being shredded by the sharp stones. She learned to cook on the open fire, her first attempts a disaster of burnt bread and watery stew. He ate it without complaint, his face a mask. But a few days later, a small sack of onions and a handful of wild herbs appeared on the table. She learned to read the sky, to feel the coming of rain in the ache of her bones. She learned the names of the birds that sang in the pines and the tracks of the deer that came to drink at the creek. The wedding dress was folded away and hidden at the bottom of a trunk. She now wore one of his old shirts, belted with a piece of rope and a rough spun skirt she had fashioned from a blanket. The soft hands of a schoolteacher were gone, replaced by the calloused, capable hands of a survivor. The silence between them remained, but its quality changed. It was no longer the silence of fear and mistrust. It was the silence of shared exhaustion, of mutual respect for the unspoken boundaries of their pain. She knew nothing of his past, of the fire that had scarred his face and his soul. He knew nothing of hers beyond the public humiliation he had witnessed. Their histories were locked away, too heavy to be spoken aloud. But in the quiet moments, in the shared tasks, they began to learn the language of each other's presence. She learned that the slight twitch in his jaw meant he was in pain. He learned that the way she stared into the fire meant she was thinking of the life she had lost. One evening, a month after she had arrived, she was mending his shirt by the firelight. Her needlework was neat and precise, a skill from her old life that had not deserted her. He was sharpening his axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel, a familiar, comforting sound. "You were a teacher," he said. The words dropped into the silence like stones into a still pond. It was the first time he had spoken of her past. She looked up, her needle poised in midair. Her heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. "Yes," she whispered. He didn't look at her. He continued to draw the whetstone along the blade of the axe. "What did you teach?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic," she paused. "I taught them to be good people." A bitter laugh escaped her. "It seems I was not a very good teacher." He stopped sharpening the axe. He looked at her then, his blue eye clear and direct in the firelight. "Being good won't save you out here," he said, his voice low. "Being strong will." He went back to his work, and the conversation was over, but the words lingered in the air. Being strong will. It was not a comfort, it was a creed. The creed of the frontier, the creed of his life. And now it was the creed of hers. She looked down at her hands, at the calluses and the small healing cuts. She was not the same woman who had knocked on his door a month ago. She was stronger. She had to be. Because she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the world she had fled would not forget her. Sooner or later, it would come looking for her. And she would have to be ready. The whispers from Redemption Creek drifted up the thin logging trail like smoke, carried on the tongues of hunters and the occasional brave child who dared to venture near the haunted land. The story had taken on a life of its own, a piece of frontier mythology. The abandoned bride, driven mad by grief, had thrown herself to the mercy of the beast, the scarred recluse of the mountains. They were a scandal, a perversion of the natural order, a fallen woman and a soulless man, living in sin in a cursed cabin. Ilara heard the whispers indirectly. A young boy, chasing a stray calf, saw her by the creek. He had stared, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, before turning and fleeing back to town, as if he had seen a ghost. A few days later, the preacher came. He rode up the trail on his sway-backed mare, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon. He stood at the edge of the clearing, refusing to come closer, his face a mask of pious disapproval. Silas saw him first. He stopped his work, his axe held loosely in his hand, and stood, a silent, intimidating sentinel. Ilara came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her makeshift apron. The three of them stood in a triangle of judgment and defiance under the vast, open sky. "Ilara, child," the preacher called out, his voice carrying an oily tone of concern. "Your father is worried sick. The whole town prays for your soul." "My soul is my own concern, Reverend," Ilara called back, her voice clearer and stronger than she had expected. The preacher's face tightened. "You are living in sin with this man. It is an abomination. You are a teacher, a woman of good standing. You must leave this place of darkness and return to the fold. You must repent." "Repent for what?" Ilara's voice rose, fueled by a sudden hot anger. "For being abandoned? For being publicly shamed? For trying to survive when I was left with nothing? Where was the town's Christian charity then?" "Reverend, I saw only pity and scorn." The preacher was taken aback, his sanctimonious certainty faltering. He looked from her defiant face to the silent, scarred man beside her. Silas hadn't moved a muscle, but his presence was a palpable threat. "He has bewitched you," the preacher stammered, pointing a trembling finger at Silas. "He is creature of violence and shadow. Come back, Ilara, before it is too late." "It is already too late, Reverend," Silas said, his voice a low growl that vibrated in the air. "She is not welcome in your town, so she will stay here." It was not a request, it was a declaration. "This is not over," the preacher sputtered, gathering his reins. "The Lord's work will be done." He turned his horse and retreated down the trail, a defeated soldier of a faith that had no place in this raw, unforgiving land. Ilara watched him go, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. She had stood her ground. She had spoken the truth. She looked at Silas. He was watching her, his expression unreadable as always. But she saw something flicker in the depths of his eye. A spark of, what? Approval? Kinship? He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned and swung his axe, sinking it deep into the log in front of him with a satisfying final thud. The gesture was clear. The conversation was over. The battle had been won, for now. But the preacher's visit was only the beginning. The town's judgment was a constant, invisible pressure. But something else began to happen, too. Small acts of solidarity, as quiet and unexpected as a wildflower blooming on a rock face. One morning, they found a small sack of flour and a jar of preserves on a stump at the edge of their land. There was no note. A week later, a bundle of children's clothes, outgrown but clean and mended, appeared in the same spot. Ilara knew it was from Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, a woman whose own daughter had been widowed young. It was a silent message of understanding, a thread of connection from one woman to another, woven through the fabric of the town's disapproval. The biggest surprise came in the form of the blacksmith's wife, a stern, hard-faced woman named Martha. She rode up one afternoon, not on the trail, but through the woods, as if to avoid being seen. She dismounted and marched toward Ilara, who was tending to a small, struggling vegetable garden she had planted. "Heard you were setting up house," Martha said, her voice gruff, avoiding eye contact. She thrust a heavy, iron pot into Ilara's hands. "A woman can't cook without a proper pot." Ilara was speechless. She stared at the pot, a solid, practical, beautiful thing. I don't know what to say, thank you," Martha just grunted. Her gaze flickered toward Silas, who was repairing the fence nearby, watching them with his usual wary stillness. "My Tom, he says this one's a hard worker," she said, jerking her chin in Silas's direction. "Says he's seen him clear more rock in 3 months than the Millers did in 10 years. A man who works that hard ain't all bad. No matter what the gossips say." She looked at Ilara then, her eyes sharp and assessing. "You look stronger, less haunted." The words were a balm to Ilara's soul, to be seen not as a victim, but as a survivor. "I am stronger," Ilara said, and she knew it was the truth. Martha nodded, satisfied. "Good, you'll need to be." She turned to leave, then paused. "Jedediah Sterling is back," she said, her voice low. "Came back last week. His father's ailing. They say Jedediah is taking over the running of the ranch. He's been asking questions about this land." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The name Jedediah was a key turning in a lock she thought had been rusted shut. He was back, and he was asking about their land. The blood drained from her face. She looked at Silas. He had gone still, his hand resting on a fence post. He had heard. Martha saw the look on her face. Her own expression softened with a flicker of sympathy. "Be careful, child," she said, her voice gentler than Ilara would have thought possible. "Men like Sterling, they don't like to lose, and they believe the whole world belongs to them." She mounted her horse and rode away, leaving Ilara standing in her small garden, the heavy iron pot in her hands, a cold dread seeping into her heart. The whispers of the town were one thing, the judgment of the preacher was another. But this was different. This was the return of the man who had tried to destroy her. And he wasn't coming with prayers or pity. He was coming with power and greed and a score to settle. The fragile peace of their small, isolated world had just been shattered. The final test was coming. She could feel it, like the distant rumble of an earthquake, a tremor that promised to bring the whole mountain down on top of them. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. The news of Jedediah's return settled over the cabin like a shroud. Silas worked with a grim, relentless fury, his axe swings harder, his silence deeper. Ilara found herself starting at every sound, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line, waiting for the shadow of a horseman that she knew would eventually appear. The fragile trust they had built, the unspoken language of shared work and quiet companionship, was now strained by a new, external threat. They were no longer just two broken people healing in isolation. They were guardians of a sanctuary that was about to be besieged. He came on a Tuesday. The sky was a searing, cloudless blue, the heat shimmering off the rocks. Ilara was washing clothes in the creek, her back to the trail. A sound, the clink of a horseshoe on stone, made her freeze. She turned slowly. It was him. Jedediah Sterling, astride a magnificent black stallion, the silver on his saddle glinting in the sun. He was just as she remembered, handsome, confident, the master of his world. But now she saw something else in his eyes, something she had been too blind with love to see before. A cold, possessive arrogance. He dismounted, his polished boots sinking slightly into the soft earth by the creek. He smiled, a practiced, charming smile that no longer reached his eyes. "Ilara, I heard I might find you here. Living like a savage, it seems." His gaze swept over her, taking in the rough clothes, her bare feet, her calloused hands. It was a look of contemptuous pity. "What do you want, Jedediah?" she asked, her voice steady. She would not let him see her fear. I came to make things right, he said, his tone reasonable, persuasive. My father. He was wrong to interfere. I was a fool to listen. I want you to come back, Alara. We can still be married. I'll build you the finest house in the valley. The offer was so absurd, so insulting, it was almost laughable. He thought he could just snap his fingers and she would come running, grateful for the scraps from his table. You think you can just erase what you did? She said, her voice trembling with a rage that was cold and pure. You humiliated me. You left me with nothing. You think a house can fix that? His smile faltered. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Don't be dramatic. It was a misunderstanding. Now be reasonable. This is no place for a woman like you, living in a shack with him. He spat the word out, his gaze flicking toward the cabin. As if summoned, Silas appeared. He walked out of the woods, silent as a predator, his axe in his hand. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his scarred face a mask of cold fury, his presence a challenge. Jedediah's hand instinctively went to the pistol holstered at his hip. Stay back, you half-breed savage, he snarled. This is my land, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. You are not welcome here. Your land? Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. This worthless patch of rock? I'm not interested. In this hovel, I'm interested in the water. He pointed with his chin toward the creek. This creek, it feeds into the Sterling Ranch. My father was a fool to let the Millers have this plot. With the drought getting worse, I need to secure my water rights. I have a deed, signed and sealed. This land and everything on it belongs to me. Alara's blood ran cold. The land, the water, it was never about her. It was always about power. About taking what he wanted. The deed is for the Miller plot, Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. My claim is separate, registered with the territorial office. You have no claim here. A squatter's claim? Jedediah sneered. Against the Sterling name? We'll see what the judge in redemption has to say about that. I'll have you run off this land by the end of the week, and I'll take her with me. He looked at Alara, his eyes glittering with a cruel possessiveness. She was promised to me. I'll not have my property living in filth with an animal. The word property was a lit fuse. Something inside Alara snapped. The fear, the shame, the months of silent struggle, it all coalesced into a single point of white-hot fury. I am not your property, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. I am not a piece of land to be bought and sold. I am a woman, and I choose to be here. This is my home. She walked to Silas's side, placing her hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it was a declaration of war. It was a choice made not in a church, but on a patch of dirt in the face of the man who had broken her. She was choosing the scarred, silent man who had shown her strength over the handsome, charming man who had shown her only weakness. Jedediah's face contorted with rage. He saw he had lost. Not just the land, but the power he thought he held over her. You'll regret this, he hissed, his voice venomous. Both of you. I'll see you burn. He mounted his horse, yanked on the reins with a vicious cruelty, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and hatred in his wake. Alara stood, her hand still on Silas's arm, her body trembling. He was solid and warm beneath her touch, an anchor in the storm. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than weariness or anger in his eyes. It was a raw, fierce protectiveness. He had not fought for the land. He had fought for her. He won't stop, she whispered, the reality of their situation crashing down on her. I know, Silas said, his voice grim. He looked up at the sky, at the relentless, burning sun. But he's not the only enemy we have. The days that followed were a blur of frantic preparation. A court date was set. Jedediah had used his family's influence to push the matter through with alarming speed. They had 1 week to prepare their case, to prove their right to the small piece of land that had become their world. But the drought, which had been a low-grade fever all summer, was worsening. The creek, their lifeblood, was shrinking daily, its cheerful gurgle reduced to a sluggish trickle. The leaves on the aspens turned yellow and brittle, long before their time. The air was dry and hot, thick with the smell of dust and dying things. A fire ban was declared in the territory. The world was a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. They worked from sunup to sundown, a desperate, silent team. Silas rode to the territorial office, a 2-day journey, to get a certified copy of his claim. Ilara, left alone, felt a fear she hadn't known since that first night. The silence of the cabin was no longer a comfort. It was a threat. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind, sounded like Jedediah returning to make good on his promise. When Silas returned, the lines of exhaustion on his face were etched deeper. He had the papers, but the clerk had warned him. The judge was a sterling appointee. Their chances were slim. The law, like everything else in this part of the world, belonged to the powerful. That night, a strange, ominous orange glow appeared on the horizon to the north. A wildfire. Miles away, but the wind was carrying the scent of smoke toward them. It was a terrifying, beautiful sight, a reminder of the untamable power of the world they lived in. They stood outside the cabin, watching the glow pulse against the night sky, a second malevolent moon. "If the wind shifts," Ilara whispered, not daring to finish the thought. "It won't," Silas said, but there was no conviction in his voice. The day of the trial was hot and still. The air was hazy with smoke, the sun a dull red ball in the sky. The town of Redemption was a hive of nervous energy. The trial was the biggest spectacle since Ilara's own failed wedding. The courtroom, which doubled as the saloon, was packed. Ilara saw the faces of the townspeople, a mixture of curiosity, hostility, and a few precious sparks of support. She saw Mrs. Gable and Martha, the blacksmith's wife, sitting together, their faces grim and determined. Jedediah was there with his lawyer, looking confident and smug. He nodded to the judge, a fat, wheezing man with a face like a spoiled ham, as if they were old friends. Ilara's heart sank. The trial was a farce. Jedediah's lawyer presented the sterling deed, a grand sweeping document that claimed half the valley. He painted Silas as a violent, unstable squatter, a threat to the community. He painted Ilara as a fallen woman, a hysteric who had been manipulated by a savage. When Silas presented his own humble claim, the judge barely glanced at it. "A piece of paper," the judge said, his voice dripping with disdain, "against the foundational deed of this county's most prominent family. It's meaningless." "It is a legal claim, registered and paid for," Silas said, his voice low and steady, though Ilara could see the muscle twitching in his jaw. "The Sterling family brought civilization to this valley," the judge declared, his voice rising as if he were giving a sermon. "They brought law and order. We will not allow that order to be threatened by drifters and squatters. I find in favor of the plaintiff. You have 24 hours to vacate the property." A gavel slammed down. It was over, just like that. Their home, their work, their future, erased by the whim of a corrupt judge. A gasp went through the crowd. Jedediah smiled, a triumphant, cruel smile. He looked at Ilara, his eyes saying, "I told you so. I always win." Ilara felt the floor drop out from under her. It was the church all over again. The public humiliation, the utter powerlessness. She felt Silas's hand on her arm, steadying her. He was looking not at the judge, not at Jedediah, but at the window. A strange, flickering light was reflecting in the glass. Then a man burst through the saloon doors. "Fire!" he screamed, his face wild with panic. The wind's shifted. It's coming down the canyon. It'll be on the town in an hour. Chaos erupted. The courtroom dissolved into a pandemonium of shrieking and shouting. People scrambled for the doors, their legal disputes forgotten in the face of a far more immediate and terrifying judgment. The fire, the spark they had all been dreading, had finally ignited their world. Jedediah's face was pale. His ranch, his empire of grass and cattle, was directly in the fire's path. He pushed his way through the crowd, shouting orders at his men, his arrogance replaced by a raw animal fear. Silas grabbed Alara's hand. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Not to the cabin, to the high rocks. It's the only place the fire won't reach." He pulled her through the panicked mob, out into the smoky, surreal daylight. The sky to the north was no longer a gentle glow. It was a roiling, angry wall of black smoke and orange flame, and it was moving toward them with terrifying speed. The roar was audible now, a constant, hungry beast. Ash began to fall like a soft gray snow. They ran through the town, past people frantically trying to save their belongings, their faces streaked with soot and tears. They ran up the trail, the air growing hotter, thicker, harder to breathe. Alara's lungs burned, her legs ached. But Silas's grip on her hand was an iron band, pulling her onward, upward. They reached their land. The cabin, their small, hard one. Sanctuary stood in the path of the inferno. There was no time to save anything. They had to keep going. As they passed the clearing, Alara saw him. Jedediah. He was on his horse, trying to herd a small group of his panicked cattle away from the fire, but they were scattering, their eyes wide with terror. He was screaming, his face a mask of desperation. He was going to be trapped. "We have to help him." Alara shouted over the roar of the fire. "It's too late." Silas yelled back, pulling her toward the rocks. "He's a fool. He'll get himself killed." But Alara pulled back. She looked at the man who had caused her so much pain, a man who was now just a small, frightened figure in the face of a power far greater than his own. And she felt not hatred, not satisfaction, but a sudden overwhelming wave of pity. "No, one deserves to die like that," she said, her voice raw. "Not even him." She looked at Silas, her eyes pleading. "You said being strong is what saves you. Is it strong to leave a man to burn?" He stared at her, his face grim, his blue eye reflecting the flames. He was torn. His hatred for Jedediah was a living thing. But her words had found a crack in his armor. He looked at the fire, then back at her. He saw the woman who had mended a broken chair, who had carried rocks until her hands bled, who had faced down a preacher in a courtroom. The woman who was teaching him, slowly, painfully, how to be human again. He let go of her hand. "Get to the rocks," he commanded, his voice a raw bark. "Don't stop for anything. Go." And then he turned and ran, not away from the fire, but toward it, toward Jedediah. Alara stood for a moment, frozen, watching him go. The scarred, broken man, running into the heart of the inferno to save his enemy, to save his soul. Then she turned and scrambled up the rocks, her heart a wild, terrified prayer. "Be strong," she thought. "Oh, please be strong." The world was fire and smoke. From her perch on the high, rocky bluff, Alara watched the apocalypse unfold. The fire swept through the canyon like a vengeful god, consuming everything in its path. It devoured the dry grass, the pines, the aspens, turning them into roaring torches. She saw it reach their clearing. For a moment, the small cabin stood defiant against the wall of flame. Then it was gone, swallowed whole. All their work, their shared silence, their fragile new life, turned to ash in an instant. A sob tore from her throat, a sound of such desolation it was swallowed by the roar of the fire. She scanned the chaos below, her eyes burning from the smoke, searching for any sign of Silas, of Jedediah. She saw nothing but a rolling, churning sea of flame. The heat was intense, even on the bluff. The air was unbreathable. She pressed the hem of her skirt to her face, her heart a cold, hard knot of terror in her chest. He was gone. She had sent him to his death. The irony was a bitter acid in her throat. She had survived her own public execution, only to lead the one person who had saved her to his. The fire passed. It moved on, a hungry beast seeking new pastures, leaving behind a blackened, smoking wasteland. The world was silent, save for the crackle and pop of cooling embers. The sky was a bruised, sickly yellow, the sun a dim ghost. It was a landscape of hell, a world scrubbed clean of life. She waited, for hours. As the smoke began to clear, she made her way down from the bluff, her legs unsteady. The ground was hot, still smoking in places. The air was thick with the stench of burnt pine and shattered dreams. She reached the clearing. Nothing was left. A few foundation stones. The twisted, blackened metal of the iron pot Martha had given her. That was all. She sank to her knees in the ash, the fight finally gone out of her. It was over. Everything was over. She was alone again, in a world of cinders. She closed her eyes, a profound, empty weariness settling over her. And then she heard it. A cough, a weak, ragged sound. Her eyes flew open. She scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. Silas? She screamed, her voice hoarse. Another cough, closer this time. She stumbled through the blackened skeletons of trees, toward the creek. And there they were, lying in the shallow, muddy water of the shrunken creek bed. Silas and Jedediah. They were both alive. Barely. They had survived by immersing themselves in the water, the fire passing over them. Silas was a mess of burns and soot, his clothes half charred away. He was leaning against the muddy bank, his breath coming in shallow, painful rasps. Jedediah was unconscious beside him, his fine clothes ruined, his face pale as death beneath the grime. Ilara slid down the bank, splashing into the water. Silas, she breathed, touching his face, her tears leaving clean tracks in the soot. On his skin, he opened his eyes. They were bloodshot, filled with pain, but they were clear. He looked at her, and a faint, crooked smile touched his lips, a strange and beautiful thing on his scarred, burnt face. "Told you," he rasped, "to get to the rocks." "You fool," she sobbed, a sound that was half grief, half overwhelming relief. "You magnificent, stubborn fool." She helped him sit up. She tore strips from her skirt to clean his wounds as best she could. He had dragged Jedediah to the creek, saving the life of the man who had tried to ruin them. It was an act of grace so profound, so unexpected, it took her breath away. They heard voices then, the townspeople emerging from their own shelters, coming to survey the devastation. The blacksmith Tom was the first to find them. He stared at the scene in the creek bed, at Silas, burned and bleeding, at the unconscious form of Jedediah Sterling, at Ilara, kneeling in the mud between them. His face was a mixture of awe and disbelief. "He saved him," Tom said, his voice hushed. The whole town saw it. Sterling was trapped. Cain went back for him. Other people gathered at the top of the bank, their faces grim with the loss of their own homes, but their eyes filled with a new kind of respect as they looked down at Silas. They saw not the town monster, but a hero. A man who, when tested by fire, had chosen not vengeance, but mercy. The resolution was not a grand affair. There was no wedding, no public declaration. There was only the slow, arduous work of rebuilding a life from the ashes. The fire that had destroyed their home had also, in a strange way, saved it. Jedediah Sterling, humbled and broken, his ranch in ruins, his pride shattered, withdrew his claim. He left Redemption Creek and was never seen again. The town united. by the shared tragedy and by the story of Silas's selfless act, looked at them differently. The whispers of scorn were replaced by murmurs of respect. They rebuilt the cabin, not alone, but with the help of their neighbors. Tom the blacksmith forged new tools. Martha brought them a new pot and blankets. Mrs. Gable came with sacks of flour and seed. The people of redemption, who had once cast them out, now welcomed them into the fold. They were no longer the outcasts. They were part of the community, a community forged anew in the crucible of the fire. One evening, months later, they stood outside the new cabin. It was stronger than the old one, built with the help of many hands. A warm light spilled from its clean window. The stars were brilliant in the clear, cold sky. The land was still, black and scarred, but here and there, small green shoots were beginning to push their way through the ash. Life was returning. Alara looked at Silas. His burns had healed, leaving new faint scars that crisscrossed the old ones. He was looking at her, his blue eyes soft in the twilight. The silence between them was no longer a space of pain and uncertainty. It was a space of comfort, of understanding, of a love that had been earned, not declared. "I never had a home," he said, his voice a low rumble, so quiet she almost missed it. "Not a real one." She took his hand. It was rough and calloused, but it was strong and steady. It fit in hers perfectly. "Me neither," she whispered. They had both been abandoned, broken, cast out. They had found each other in the darkness and walked through fire together. They were not the people they had been. They were stronger. They were scarred. They were whole. Their family was not one of blood, but of choice, forged in silence and survival, and sealed in the ashes of a world remade. He squeezed her hand, a simple, profound gesture of belonging. They stood there for a long time, watching the stars come out. Two souls who had found their redemption, not in a church or a courtroom, but in the stubborn, resilient soil of home they had built together. They were broken, and now they were loved.